The pericardium is a tough sac that surrounds and protects the heart. It's going to restrict heart movement so that it moves only slightly within the thorax. And this is important because it reduces friction. It also prevents the heart from overfilling with blood. The pericardium is composed of two important layers. The tough outer sac is called the fibrous pericardium, and there's also a serous pericardium, which is a wet membrane that surrounds the heart, and it's a double layered membrane. The two membranes are the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. So the visceral pericardium is directly touching the heart, and between the visceral and the parietal pericardium is a thin potential space, which is called the pericardial cavity, and it contains serous fluid. This slide is showing the pericardium as well as other layers of the heart wall. We can see first the fibrous pericardium is the outermost layer of the pericardium. Then there's the double layered serous pericardium. The outer layer of that is the parietal pericardium. The inner layer of that is the visceral pericardium. It's also called the epicardium, which is the outermost layer of the heart wall, which we can also see on this diagram. Between the visceral and the parietal pericardium is the parietal layer with serous fluid. And the serous fluid is going to play an important role. It's going to reduce friction when the heart is contracting. So we see our outer fibrous pericardium. Underneath that is the double layered serous membrane with the parietal pericardium, and then the inner visceral pericardium, also called the epicardium. And then the heart wall is going to contain three important layers. The outer membrane is the epicardium, the middle layer is the myocardium, and the inner is the endocardium. The myocardium is very important cardiac muscle that's going to be thickest in the left ventricle, which is actually what we're looking at right here. So those layers from superficial to deep are the epicardium. Again, that's the visceral pericardium. The myocardium is cardiac muscle tissue. And again, it's going to be the thickest of the three layers. And specifically, it is thicker on the left side of the heart in the left ventricle. The inner layer, which is going to be the layer that comes in contact with the blood, is the endocardium. It's going to be one layer thick, and it's simple squamous epithelial cells. This slide is showing those layers in a little more detail. So we can see first the outermost layer of the epicardium, again, also the visceral pericardium. The middle layer is the myocardium, which is cardiac muscle. You can actually see the organization of the cardiac muscle here. You can even see the intercalated discs, which are only present in cardiac muscle cell. Those intercalated discs are going to allow for ions to pass quickly from one cell to another. We also see the presence of striations. One important thing to know about cardiac muscle is that it is involuntary, unlike skeletal muscle, which is voluntary. And again, that's going to be the thickest layer of these different layers of the heart. And then the innermost layer is endothelium, which makes up the endocardium, and it is going to be in contact with the blood. So the external heart anatomy is what we're going to take a look at next. And the heart is composed of four hollow chambers. You need to know that the superior chambers are called atria, and the inferior chambers are called ventricles. So the blood is going to pass from the right atrium to the right ventricles, and this is going to be on the right side of the heart, which is for pulmonary circulation. And specifically, it's going to have deoxygenated blood in it, because the goal of this side of the heart is to send the deoxygenated blood to the lungs where it picks up the oxygen. After it picks the oxygen up, the blood passes from the left atrium to the left ventricle into the aorta and on to systemic circulation. So at this point, the blood is oxygenated. It's freshly oxygenated blood that's been received from the lungs, goes to left atrium, left ventricle, and then out of the heart. On the external part of the heart, we also see a depression called the coronary sulcus. It's a groove that separates the atria and the ventricles. There's another sulcus called the anterior interventricular sulcus, which we'll see on the models in the next slide. And another one called the inferior interventricular sulcus, located between the ventricles. So on this view, we see the anterior view of the heart. Whenever you look at the heart, you want to focus on the aorta first. And when it looks like this, it's always going to be the anterior view of the heart. You can locate the atria pretty well. This is the right atrium, and the left atrium is shown on this side. So this would be the left atrium here. We see a little bit of it, but we can see more of the right atrium on the anterior view. The ventricles are going to be much larger, and in fact, they account for the large specific region of the heart. This is going to be the right ventricle in here. This is going to be the left ventricle in here. So notice the conical corner of the heart, which is the apex, and the base of the heart is going to be right at the right atrium in this general vicinity here. The sulcuses that were mentioned on the previous slide are shown here. First, we have the anterior interventricular sulcus. We have a coronary sulcus, as well as shown over here. Those are where coronary blood vessels are actually located, in those sulcuses. So the ascending aorta is located here. Again, that's going to help you identify that it's the anterior side of the heart. And then the pulmonary trunk is going to be right next to it. Those are going to be the great vessels. When we look at the posterior view of the heart, you can first notice that you don't see that arch of the aorta. So in the posterior view, you're going to see the back of the aorta, which is called the aortic arch. It's called this right before it starts to descend. So this is where it's actually cut off. Just underneath the aortic arch is the pulmonary blood vessels. Specifically, the pulmonary arteries branch out of the pulmonary trunk. And then the pulmonary veins, which are collapsed on this model, on this cadaver preparation, are going to be collapsed, but they return oxygenated blood back to the left-hand side. Since it's the posterior side, we can see the right atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. The sulcus, there's a coronary sulcus. We can see on the posterior side of the heart as well. So it kind of wraps around the heart between the atria and the ventricles. And then there's also a posterior interventricular sulcus as well, which is between the ventricles. Other important blood vessels that we'll go over are things like the vena cava. Coronary sinus is a coronary blood vessel, as well as the middle cardiac vein and the posterior interventricular artery.